Hi everyone, today we're going to cover lesson 7, which is covering the last stage for the improvement science methodology, the sustaining improvement phase. As you can recall that the improvement science methodology consists of 5 phases. So today we're going to look at the last phase, and this phase requires you to continue to monitor and plan for future improvement, including sustaining the change or conducting a full-scale implementation. So these are the objectives for today's lesson. We'll be able to learn how to share the project outcomes with stakeholders, as well as document the future plans for your project. So for the sustaining improvement phase, the project team will need to gather to evaluate and validate the results. And then they have to decide what are the following actions that need to be done. Okay, so by doing so, they can actually share the findings with the key stakeholders and then gather their feedback. And then finally decide what to do with the innovation, whether they're going to adopt it, reject it, or test it further in a full-scale implementation. So let's look at the first step, which is to share the project outcomes with the stakeholders. So after they have completed the results, the project team will need to sell the results of their efforts. They need to communicate their message to the key stakeholders, and one common way to do so is through the A3 report. Alright, the A3 report is a concise report that is used to identify and comprehensively convey the most important project information related to the improvement of the process. Now, let us have a look at how an A3 report looks like. Okay, it should have a background, the problem statement and objectives. It should also state the current and future conditions. It should also include a cost analysis, implementation plan using a PDSA cycle, as well as a follow-up, like for example, the project impact, what are the lesson learned, and how to sustain this change. So this is an example of how an A3 report will look like. Here is another example. Okay, I have provided a web link at the bottom of the slide. Feel free to click on it and find out more information or examples of an A3 report. Okay, the next step involves the team documenting the follow-up plans for the project after they have discussed and shared their findings with the stakeholders. So once you have validated your improvement, the project team will need to sustain the change. Otherwise, it will just be temporary or limited in scope. So this whole step, right, is actually known as the organizational change or change management. There are actually two change theories which the project team can use to guide change management. The first one is known as Lewin's 3-stage model of change, including the force field analysis. And the second one is Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory, which involves the 5-step innovation decision process. We will talk about this in details shortly. Now, let us look at the first change theory, which is the Lewin's 3-stage model of change. I'm just going to provide a brief explanation about what this change model is all about. Okay, so Lewin proposes a few principles. The first principle is that change go through 3 phases, which is unfreezing, moving, and refreezing. Alright, he believed that this change process is actually a dynamic balance of forces which work in opposite direction, trying to influence the so-called movement towards the change. Okay, and he defined driving forces as those factors that facilitate the change towards the desired direction. And he defined the restraining forces as those factors that impede or so-called oppose your so-called change. So the last principle that he mentioned is that change can occur, right, and will occur if you add additional new force or driving force towards the change, or you can change the direction of the opposing or restraining forces. Or sometimes what you can do is to effect your change, right, you can change the magnitude of any of the forces. Now this picture summarizes what Lewin's 3-stage model of change looks like. So this picture shows you how the Lewin's model of change overlaps with the steps that you have learned so far. So you can see that the unfreezing phase actually address step number 1, which is to try to convince the stakeholders your project outcomes and benefits. And then as you move along your direction of change, the moving phase and the refreezing phase involve how you're going to provide the follow-up plans for your project and how you're going to effect the change throughout the whole organization. Now I'm going to show you a video to explain more about Lewin's model of change. Let's have a look.
This presentation will provide a brief history and overview of Kurt Lewin and two of his most noted theories and models. Kurt Lewin was a German-American psychologist known as one of the pioneers of social, organizational, and applied psychology. He is credited as the first to study group dynamics and organizational development. Today, we will go over a bit of his background and two of his most famous theories and models, the force field analysis and the three-stage change model. Lewin was born in Germany in 1890 and began his education and studies there. He served as a soldier in World War I, but was wounded and returned to Germany, obtaining his doctorate from the University of Berlin in 1916. During his doctoral research, Lewin became increasingly interested in philosophical science, Gestalt psychology, and group dynamics. His research gained much attention as a well-published psychologist, and in 1930, Lewin was invited to the University of Stanford as a visiting professor. In 1933, because of Hitler's rise to power in Germany, he decided to immigrate to the United States with his wife and daughter. He worked at Cornell University and the University of Iowa until 1944, when he helped to establish the Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT. It was during this time that he became famous for his research in group dynamics, specifically force field analysis and the three-stage change model. Lewin's theory of force field analysis essentially defines and describes all forces supporting and opposing a desired change and uses that information to determine the viability of the change. This model is used as a framework and simple visual tool for leaders. It identifies the factors and forces that influence both sides of a situation, identifying driving forces that provide momentum toward a goal, as well as resisting or restraining forces that work to block or hinder change. It helps indicate the underlying balance of power and identify potential stakeholders and their positions to better prepare for and make decisions. Part of the reason that this model is successful is that it calls on leaders to look at situations as a whole versus focusing on smaller or more individual aspects of a scenario. Each identified force is ranked on a 1 to 5 point scale based on their level of influence, 1 being very weak and 5 being extremely strong. Once all forces have been identified, each side can be totaled, and a leader can determine the feasibility of the desired change. The stakeholders can then review the forces to determine potential mitigation strategies that might change the overall balance and potentially support the decision or change. Take, for example, a change that all of us have experienced on some level. Wearing a face mask to help prevent the spread of COVID-19 would be identified as the desired behavior. There are forces on both sides in support and in opposition of this behavior. Lewin's force field analysis would be useful to identify the fact that this change does seem feasible, and it can also work to identify opposing forces that can be planned for and later dealt with accordingly. Lewin's three-stage change model breaks down any change into 3 equally important phases. Each phase should be considered thoughtfully in order to ensure a change becomes sustainable and permanent. The three-stage change model, also known as the Lewin change model and unfreeze change refreeze method, is a model developed by Lewin describing the change process to help us gain a better understanding of it. The first stage is called unfreezing. This is where we recognize the need for change, determine what behaviors and/or attitudes need to be changed, and ensure there is adequate support and communication to move forward toward the second stage. By identifying the impact of the current issues or problems, you help those impacted become aware of the why to help them unfreeze. Lewin's force field analysis can be used to assist with this step by better understanding the change. Be aware that aspects of change relating to uncertainty or cultural shifts can make unfreezing difficult for some employees and will require strong guidance and support from leadership. The second stage is the actual change. During this transitional stage, the determined changes are implemented. Support, again, is critical here to ensure the appropriate changes are being made and understood. The change stage can be difficult due to employees being forced to adapt, overcome their fears or resistance, and implement the actual change. The final stage is called freezing or refreezing. During this stage, changes are reinforced, rewarded, and stabilized. Successes are celebrated, and the goal is to integrate these changes into the culture of the organization and treat it as the norm. Lewin's 3-step process is regarded as a foundational model for making change in organizations. An example of this change model in use would be the Traeger company transition. In the unfreeze stage, the CEO identified what behaviors and attitudes needed to be changed to work toward a healthier company culture. This included numerous meetings and cultural surveys to gain a deeper understanding of the underlying issues. He also prepared for the change by hiring some trusted executives that he could rely on to assist with the transition and created the plan in secret. In the change stage, the company changed their location and evaluated employees based on new company goals and norms, letting go of and moving employees as needed. Specific steps were taken to enhance the physical environment to make it more reflective of the company and their desired culture and values. During the refreeze stage, employees are praised and rewarded for adapting to the new company culture, and the change is successfully integrated as the norm. To help sustain the change, company gatherings have become routine and are focused on supporting the new, open, and supportive culture needed to help enhance the business aspects of the company. So remember, Lewin's force field analysis identifies and ranks all forces in favor and resistance of a desired change and uses this information to determine the feasibility of the change. It can also be useful to identify and plan for potential hindrances. The three-stage change model reminds us that it is important to unfreeze behavior before changing it and then refreezing that new desired behavior. It's like thawing your frozen food before you cook it.
Now, I hope you have a better understanding about Lewin's change theory. The next theory I'm going to talk about is the Rogers theory. So Rogers theory is quite complex, but it can be summarized in 2 points. The first point is known as the innovation decision process. So Rogers believed that change goes through a 5-stage linear process. So the first stage involved knowledge, whereby the project team will share information about the innovation. Alright, then the team will go on to try to persuade the so-called stakeholders to try to convince them to accept the change. Okay, and then when it comes to the third stage, this is where the stakeholders and the project team will decide whether to adopt or reject the innovation. If they choose to accept, then this is where they go on to the fourth and fifth stage, whereby they implement and then confirm whether to accept the so-called adopt the innovation throughout the whole organization. Now, throughout this whole process, right, Rogers also believes that this whole process can be reversible. You can go through it again and again until so-called change is being accepted or rejected. Okay, the next point that he shared about is the 5 adoptive categories. He believes that different people or different groups of people will respond to innovation and change differently. And he classified these groups of people into 5 categories. And he also proposed strategies to deal with the groups. Now let's have a look at the next slide to understand more. So this is a pictorial diagram to explain what is Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory all about. So from here you can see how the Rogers theory overlaps with what you have learned for your steps for this lesson. So you can see that Rogers' knowledge and persuasion stages overlaps with step number 1, which is to get the so-called project team to share the project outcomes and benefits, and hopefully to convince the stakeholders to adopt the change and try to implement and test out the change itself. And then you can see that the Rogers decision, implementation, and confirmation stage actually address the step number 2, which is to get the project team to come up with the follow-up plans about how to execute your project and how to implement it throughout the whole organization. And if it's not successful, of course, Rogers believed that this so-called whole change management can be rejected as well. So there are actually options whether to accept or reject the project change.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Smith. This screencast is on the diffusion of innovations theory and was completed by Kay Kraveski and Lauren Smith. We'll be talking a little bit about the history and the background of the theory, what the key concepts are, and what the purpose is, as well as some advantages and limitations, and then we're going to take a deeper look at the Pool-Cool program, which utilized this theory in its practice. So diffusion of innovations theory is actually one of the oldest social theories out there and was developed in 1962 by E.M. Rogers. And the purpose of the study is really to determine how an idea or an innovation gains momentum and spreads through a population over a period of time. And the end result is the goal of adoption of that idea or that innovation. The theory of diffusion of innovations is defined as the overall spread of an innovation, the process by which that innovation is communicated through certain channels, again, over time among members of a social system. Innovation is defined as the idea, the practice, the object that is perceived as new by an individual or other unit of adoption. So again, when we talk about innovations and awareness on the next slide, it's how is this different than something before? So what influences knowledge? Again, awareness is the first thing. We have to expose a population to the innovation or idea, and they need to understand the function of the new idea and the innovation. And they may ask themselves, well, how is this any better than what's previously been done? Persuasion is the process where we start to form attitudes towards innovation, and this can be positive or negative attitudes, but that will help to determine what the decision is in the early stages of adoption. So the decision, again, can go either way. They're going to choose whether to start adopting the theory or innovation or not. If they choose to, they may implement that theory by making the change, and that can be using a new product or behavioral change. And after some time, there's the confirmation stage, and that's the reinforcement for change. The decision to adopt is actually influenced by three types of knowledge. Awareness knowledge, again, that's the innovation exists and what it does. Procedural knowledge is how to use the innovation. And principle knowledge is understanding how the innovation works. There are several stages of innovation, and the development is when we do all the decisions and activities that occur from the early stage of the idea to its actual development and production. Dissemination is the effort designed to make the innovation more widely available to certain populations or social systems. Adoption is the start or uptake of that program by the target audience. Implementation is the active use of the innovation or idea. Maintenance is the ongoing use of over time, which kind of ties into the sustainability side, which is the degree to which innovation is actually continued after the initial resources are expended. This is something we've talked a lot about in our other forums, so I know this is something that we're all interested in learning more about. But how does this innovation, this idea, continue on over time? And institutionalization is incorporation of the program into routines of organizations or a broader policy. There are 5 adoptive categories which this graph represents: the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards. The innovators want to be first. They're adventuresome, they're ready to seek and develop new ideas on their own, and they're willing to take risks. They need very little persuasion to get things done or to start an innovation or idea in this population. Early adopters are opinion leaders. They enjoy their leadership roles, they embrace change as it comes, they're comfortable with new ideas and change, and they know that it's needed. To get this population on board typically is the how-to manuals on how to implement a new idea or innovation. They do not require the information to convince them to do the change. The early majority, however, does need a little bit of convincing. They're rarely in leadership roles, but they're willing to adapt new ideas before the average population. But they do need a little evidence that the innovation works before they're willing to start adopting them themselves. Success stories are effective, typically in getting this population on board. The late majority, however, is very skeptical of change. They might be willing to try once a majority of the population has tried, but they're going to want numbers and statistics showing them how many people have actually adopted this innovation successfully. And then, of course, the last group is the hardest group to convince to change. They're very conservative. They do need statistics. They need peer appeals, and they may even need a little bit of pressure to start or begin using an innovation or an idea. So the characteristics of innovation that affect diffusion are relative advantage. It's seen as better than an idea, a product, or a program. Compatibility is how compatible is it with the intended user volumes, their norms, their beliefs, and their perceived needs. Complexity is it easy to use or understand. Trialability is intended users can experiment on a limited basis before the innovation is fully adopted. And observability is the benefits that are easily identified and visible to others. Some final points around this theory is that specific properties will affect the rate and extent of the population and of the innovation. And what that really means is there's several factors that may extend the rate or slow the rate of the adoption of an idea. Social systems can affect diffusion, as well as the external change agents that help secure adoption or slow diffusion. It's depending on the population, you may get a group of people who are quick to adapt and some who are not quick to adapt, even in the same topic. And we'll get into that when we talk about our Pool Cool program. And of course, communication between the change agent and the client really will help to speed up diffusion. And again, communication is a big piece of this. So what are some advantages of the diffusion of innovations theory? The ability to determine what factors actually influence adoption helps develop new ideas and innovations and determine how those innovations and ideas are going to be spread through a population. It also highlights peer-to-peer and peer network interactions to determine what the best route to get the information out to a population is. And it takes a deeper look into different user needs. And this may be one population in a rural area compared to an urban area, or it might be an elderly population compared to a millennial population. It looks at the different user needs and determines what's the best way they're going to adopt this innovation. However, there are some limitations. Diffusion research is criticized for its pro-innovation bias, which is the assumption that it is given that the innovation will be diffused and adopted by all members of the target group rather than being rejected. It also has an individual bias, which means that it blames the individual for the problems rather than the system being part of that problem. The theory does not work well for cessation of behaviors or prevention of behaviors, but it does help with beginning new behaviors. The theory does not account for an individual's socioeconomic status or what available resources are able to adopt the innovation. And the theory did not actually originate in public health, so it has been a little bit more challenging for the public health studies. But where has it been successful? Communications, agriculture, public health, criminal justice, social work, and marketing. And we're going to dive into our Pool Cool program in the next little moment to find out where this has been beneficial.
I hope you have a better understanding about what Rogers' theory is all about. The next thing we're going to look at is the barriers to change management. These barriers can be classified into 4 types. The first one is actually project related, whereby there are project mismatched with the context, or the project may lack evidence or might be poorly designed. The next type is actually the organizational context, whereby the organization does not allow you to have the financial or resources support, as well as maybe the structure does not even permit the innovation to be implemented. Okay, and the third one is actually the social context, whereby people are very used to the routine practice, norms, and then maybe the opinion of some leaders actually opposes it. Then you might have trouble having the change being implemented. And the fourth one is actually individual context, whereby maybe an individual lack the awareness, the knowledge, or even the attitude towards accepting the change. So these are things that you want to consider when you want to implement change. So in order to overcome all these barriers to change management, you need change strategies. Now you must understand that ultimately organizational change is all about people, and there are actually ways you can use or consider using to positively influence specific groups of people to accept the change. This chart shows you a variety of ways that you can implement it. Okay, the first one is actually education and communication. By giving them information, you hope to be able to convince them of the need to change. The second one involves participation and involvement. By getting them to be involved in your project, you might actually gain their support along the way, because they actually are committed to the so-called change because of their involvement. Okay. The third one involves facilitation and support. This is where you can get a change champion, to come and help you to provide training for new staff, or giving them time off to to learn how to adapt to the change. So this is useful when it comes to overcoming the fear and anxiety for the people who is involved in the change. Now the fourth one involves negotiation and agreement. This is where you need to work out some incentive for them, especially when it comes to facing active or potential resistance. So hopefully you can buy their support, lessen their resistance, and although this process is time consuming, but it might be a worthwhile thing to do to gain their support over in the long term. Now the fifth one involves manipulation and cooptation. So in this case, right, managers or project teams might resort to covert attempts to influence them. So it might even involve you to selectively use certain information or conscious structuring or events to convince them to buy their support. Now bear in mind that this is not a form of participation, but rather to try to minimize the so-called resistance to your change. Of course, it can be a quick solution, but it can also lead to future problem if the person or the people involved in the change feel manipulated. So you have to be careful when you want to consider manipulation as a tactic. Now the last one is even worse, whereby you use explicit or even implicit coercion. And this is where you face strong resistance, and sometimes you have no choice because you have to implement such change, right? And this is where you can actually have to force the people to accept the change by punishing them, or even giving them depriving them of certain benefits, such as maybe promotion possibility or this. Now coercion strategy is usually the last resort that should be considered, and it can be very risky because it leaves people with a bad aftertaste of the change. Yeah, so just bear that in mind that you have actually 6 options or approach that you can use for change strategies. Now this similar table shows you the way that you can choose to adopt the different change management strategies. So in this chart you can see there are 5 approaches, and the type of choice that you make for the approaches depends on the speed of effort that you want, the amount of planning that you need, and the involvement of others as well. So from the chart, you can see that the higher it operates on a continuum, if you want it to be faster, then you might need to take a more directive or even so-called assertive approach. But if you let's say time is on your side, then you might want to consider taking a more participative approach, because it actually helps to gain more support over the long term. Okay, we have come to the end of today's lesson. These are the summary points for today's lesson. Thank you.